Perhaps the most significant question in the last 20 or 30 years in the church has been, what do we do about stagnant church growth? What do we do about declining church growth? The mega churches offer one option, one alternative, one answer. We hear a lot now as well about leadership conferences. I think Andy Stanley has his own separate leadership podcast that looks at that question. Certainly we need healthy leadership. And there's been a kind of resurgence in embracing the small church as a viable model, as a helpful model, as a good model in the kingdom of God. So that question of how we achieve church growth, how we should go about looking for it, what is the role of consultants in helping us do that, how much a congregation should change to appeal to more people, those are all questions that face many, many churches. And that's what we're going to talk about today. I've got someone in the studio, I've got someone on Google Hangout, and I've got someone on the phone, and just really three excellent people to talk about this. I'm really humbled that all three could be here. But I'm Evan McClanahan. I'm the pastor over at First Evangelical Lutheran Church here in town. We're about a mile south of downtown, and our website is www.felchouston.org. You can email me with any questions or thoughts at emc2@felchouston.org. And this show is called Sin Boldly. No, we do not encourage people to sin, much less to sin boldly, but rather to live faithfully in a sinful world and to live boldly, which is how Christians must live in this world. So this show is basically a look, this program is basically a look at Christian apologetics, issues going on in the church and society at large. And today we're going to really focus in on church growth. If you're listening to this, then you know all about KPFT already, but do go to kpft.org. We're in the last day of our winter pledge drive. Do check it out. Become a member. It's only $25 to become a member, and we are at about 83% of our goal for this pledge drive, so please help us finish strong and mention Sin Boldly when you call in to make a donation. It would sure help. There is what we try to do here on this show is bring you religious content that no one else brings you, that Christian radio doesn't bring you. Leave it to a relatively progressive secular radio station to bring you Christian content that isn't brought anywhere else. But I can only do that because I've got great guests, and let me introduce them now. My three guests are, one is a lifelong church growth expert, if you will. Certainly, I think that could be said. Dr. Gary McIntosh. In 1970, Gary graduated from Colorado Christian University with a BA in Biblical Studies. He managed a business in Denver, Colorado for a while. Then he attended Western Seminary in Portland, Oregon, graduating in 1975 with a master's in divinity in pastoral studies. He located Southern California to pastor a church and then entered Fuller Theological Seminary and graduated with a D.Min. in church growth studies in 1982. In 2000, he again entered Fuller Theological Seminary and graduated in 2005 with a Ph.D. in intercultural studies. And Gary is currently professor of Christian ministry and leadership at Talbot School of Theology, Biola University. And to date, Gary has published 24 books, 6 manuals, and hundreds of articles on church growth, leadership, and pastoral ministry. As a consultant, he has worked with over 1,200 churches in the United States, Canada, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Australia. So Gary's with us here on the phone. Karl Vaters has been on the show before. He is the author of the book, The Grasshopper Myth, Big Churches, Small Churches, and the Small Thinking That Divides Us. On his blog, Pivot, he writes about innovative leadership from a small church perspective for ChristianityToday.com several times a week. He's also the founder of NewSmallChurch.com, a ministry that encourages and connects and equips innovative small church pastors. And then with me here in studio is Eugene Wilson. He's a leadership expert focusing on the growth and development of church leaders as well as Christian business leaders. Additionally, he serves as executive pastor at the Pentecostals in Katy, Texas. Innovative name for a church, by the way. The Pentecostals. I like that. A best-selling author. His latest book, Leading Growth, was released in the fall of 2016. Other books are 70, Everyone Needs a Team, and Realign, God-Called Leaders Connecting with Their Purpose. He's also a monthly columnist for the Pentecostal Herald. Well, guys, I'm really humbled that we could come together. This is kind of like a mini conference, if you will, on church growth. And let me just throw out a quote to kind of get the ball rolling here. This is from someone y'all may have heard of, Scott Thuma, who's a scholar, and he seems to study megachurches quite a bit. And generally, I do think he's supportive of small churches. But one thing he said in an article a while back kind of stuck with me, and I've kept it on file. He said and he's speaking about small churches, he says, they can forget about serving God and try to appeal to the market, or they can say we aren't going to do anything and hide our head in the sand and die a slow death. There seems to be a kind of attitude that basically says we have to change or we'll die. There's some of us, like this codgy old Lutheran fuddy-duddy speaking, who want to question that a little bit and say, well, what is the church? What is the purpose of the church? What do we do if the world turns against us? What if that just means that we're going to be small? How innovative do we have to be? How much change do we have to do to survive and to grow? So I think those are some of the questions before us. But Karl, why don't you get us started? You wrote The Grasshopper Myth. I, by the way, appreciate you sending that to me after our interview, and I did read it thoroughly. But why don't you kind of start? Tell us about what led you to writing The Grasshopper Myth, and maybe some of the response you've gotten from it.
Yeah, sure. First of all, grateful to be on with my esteemed colleagues here who have far more experience in both church leadership and book writing than I do. So I'm humbled to be on the panel with you and grateful for the opportunity for this conversation that you're giving us, Evan. To start out, to answer your question, I'm a pastor. I've been a pastor for the last 34 years. I have always pastored small churches, but I didn't know I was a small church pastor until about 7 or 8 years ago. And I thought I was a big church pastor that just hadn't arrived yet. But, after 22, 23 years waiting for that train, you wonder if it's ever going to pull into the station. So I went through a season of real soul searching and wondering, have I messed up somewhere? Because about the only quote unquote excuse that's often allowed for a church to be small or stay small is, well, if you're in a small town, what can you do? Mm-hmm. But I live in Orange County, California. This is the county where, according to Rick Warren in the Purpose Driven Church, he said, I researched the best place in America to build a big church, and he found Orange County, California. It's a great place for church growth. There's a lot of people here. It's a challenging place because it's not Bible Belt, really. It's conservative, but it's not mm-hmm. Bible Belt. This is the county I've been in now for the last 24 years, and my church remains small. So I went through this period of soul searching, trying to figure out, am I broken? Is the church broken? Has my approach been wrong? What is it? And long story short, I came to the conclusion that, in fact, although I've certainly made mistakes in ministry, it wasn't those mistakes that had caused my church not to become mega or even big, but that, in fact, my gifts, my calling, and the needs of my community come together in a way that make doing church within a small church context what God has called me to do, at least for now, if not for most or all of the rest of my ministry. And as I discovered that, I looked around and discovered, of course, the stats that we all know are that's where the vast majority of churches are. 90% of my colleagues in ministry are pastoring small churches of my size or smaller, quite frankly. And as I started looking around for help as to how to pastor a small church well, I really came up virtually empty. There were little slivers of help here and there, but almost everything I found was about how to make my church bigger or how to adapt new ideas and methods as your church gets bigger, but very, very little about how to do small church well. So I just started researching it myself and writing down my frustrations, my discoveries, the things that we did well. I would reverse engineer and discover how we did that well, and then I started writing about it. But the bottom line for me is I don't want churches to be small, but I want small churches to be great. And I think small churches can be great, and many of them are great and are making great contributions to the kingdom of God. And now we need to shine a spotlight on that.
Yeah. And I'll just say one thing, and then I want to bring Gary in here. But, I probably have the smallest church of anyone on the panel. I would say on a Sunday morning, we have maybe a good Sunday would for us would be 75 or 80 dear souls worshiping the Lord together. And so I think one of the things that people who do pastor small churches struggle with is a sense of failure in ministry, a sense that maybe we're letting our churches down, a sense that we're letting God down, because we've tried everything. And one thing you say in your book, Karl, is that you went to the conferences, you read the books. Every year or two, it was like a different author, a different set of techniques, a different way to grow the church. Your staff was always trying different things, and that over time kind of led to fatigue, right, and burnout ultimately, right?
Yeah, it really did. I wasn't and still am not opposed to church growth. And I want to say this really loud and right up front. Yep. I'm not anti-church growth, and I'm not anti-big church. That's the reason for the subtitle of my book. It is small thinking that divides us into these big church and small church camps. Even though big churches and small churches operate by different sets of principles, we're all on the same team.
Yep.
So it's not about putting one type down. It's about getting everybody involved. But yeah, we reached a certain fatigue in trying to find a method for making the church bigger until we finally settled into, we're going to try to be the best church of this size that we can possibly be. And if the Lord brings growth to that, we will welcome that with open arms. We will do whatever we can to make ourselves available to that numerical growth. But if the Lord has different ways for us to contribute to the growth of his church, we will be open to that as well.
Yeah. Gary, come in on that. You've been in the church growth. You got your degree in church growth since 1982. So you've been around this a long time. It's definitely your life's calling. So come back on some of what you heard there and offer some thoughts in general.
Again, let me just welcome everybody. Thanks for having me on. It's just great to interact with everyone. Actually, I first became connected with the church growth movement in 1975, which was the year I graduated from seminary with the master's degree. And church growth in the United States had really just started about 1972, and so I was right there kind of at the beginning. And I was the pastor of a small church. My first church out of seminary was 29 people, and I think on Easter we had 36, so that was our high Sunday. And I found the church growth movement because I was searching for help. What do you do with a church of 29 discouraged people who are, low morale and don't really want to do much about reaching out to the community or anything of that nature? And as a small church pastor, I found just tremendous help in a practical way in the church growth movement at that particular time. I did not feel, the discouragement that comes across in Karl's book and also from other small church pastors. Over the years, I've talked to a number of small church pastors who have shared similar types of feelings and stories as Karl does in his book. And I think what you said at the beginning, Evan, is really true. I think that the feelings that have been engendered among a lot of pastors is an unintended consequence of the church growth movement. If you go back and read the original founder of the church growth movement, Donald McGavran, what you'll discover is that he is really not promoting megachurches at all. And in fact, when he was in India as a missionary for 31 years, he planted 15 churches, and I think the average attendance was about 75 people in each of those 15 churches that he planted over a 31-year career. And when he founded the church growth movement, it was basically the mission was to make disciples, Matthew chapter 28, to make disciples of all the nations. And in order to really make disciples of all the nations, what that means is church primarily has to be a small church. And I think, Karl, I read your book. Thanks for sending it to me. When I get home, I'll send you a couple of mine to pay you back. But Karl mentions in there, and I agree with Karl, that really, to reach the world for Christ, it's not going to be the mega church. It's primarily going to be smaller churches that can infiltrate all the clans and the tribes and the family units around the world. And that was the original heart and intent of the church growth movement, was to help churches of all sizes, but particularly small churches, to be more effective and fruitful in making disciples. Somewhere along the line, and I would say it was probably in the 1990s in the United States, other places like Korea, maybe a little bit earlier, the church growth movement got co-opted, I think, or another word might be hijacked, by kind of a more popular church growth opinion that is driven by the mega churches. Mega churches get a lot of visibility, as we know. You know, if books are going to be written, you're going to write books on the big church, not the small church, that sort of thing. And I think if you go back and read the original church growth authors, McGavran and Ralph Winter and early Peter Wagner books, not later Peter Wagner books, but early Peter Wagner books, I think what you'll find that there's no intended desire to create mega churches per se. It's to help churches be more effective in making disciples. And then somewhere around the 1990s, there was this kind of shifting, at least in America, towards more this kind of a popular church growth agenda of creating mega churches. And I think that, unfortunately, it's created at least a context or an atmosphere that has made a lot of pastors in smaller churches feel inadequate and insecure, which is unfortunate.
That's really interesting. I don't know if y'all are familiar with Janet Mefford, but a few years ago she, I won't go into that. She was helpful in Mark Driscoll's demise, for better or worse. But somewhere in that scandal, the phrase, the evangelical industrial complex, was given birth. I don't know if that's a phrase y'all have ever heard, but it's used a lot in discernment circles, who are critical of some of the more salacious or less than humble church growth kind of tactics or whatever. But I think maybe that was kind of the game changer when you had you end up with this kind of complex of media, between television channels and books and radio and then internet. And I don't know. And maybe that's part of what changed it, was like growth feeding on growth and lifting up folks who really became celebrities. But Eugene Wilson here of the Pentecostals of Katy, come on in here. You're someone who you've read Gary's books, and and before I even contacted you, you had already read Karl's book. So given what you do as well, you come in on this, offer some observations on church leadership, church growth, the movement at large, and that kind of thing.
Thank you, Evan, for inviting me and connecting me with Karl and Gary. Thank you all so much. It's an honor to be a part of this discussion. First of all, I grew up in a very small church. My father is a pastor, and of a very small church in comparison to mega churches for sure. And my brother now pastors that church, and my entire life has been around the ministry. I left and assisted my father actually after I returned home from a Bible college or seminary, and then at the age of 30 began to pastor. And I was actually, kind of funny note, I was elected. Is how I became the pastor of the church by 11 people. The former pastor who had started the church, he had founders' rights, so he and his wife were able to vote, but they were not going to stay. So they told me beforehand that I would be elected with 11 yeses, and because they had already talked to the people, and they had the election, and there was actually 6 yeses and 4 or 5 noes. And of course, the pastor and his wife that had founded the church voted for us. They left, so that meant that I assumed the church with 5 no's and 4 yeses, and you can imagine what that was like. So it was a journey, needless to say. And but I'm fascinated with both sides of this. I think that one of the things is that we live in a society that is driven by success, and how we gauge success or how we measure that is usually by the numbers. And I think the church has done the same thing. I think maybe perhaps we kind of created the foundation for this a long time ago, because I think it's been a long time that we would count the number of attendees to our churches. So I think we've perhaps we started off with the wrong measuring stick, and we've kind of created the environment in which we have right now. And yet I want to be very cautious of that, because I appreciate my father, my brother. I have a lot of friends, relatives that are in the ministry, having been there myself. I don't want to project that these guys are not doing something, and yet at the same time, I think that there is something in us that we all want to continue to grow. I know the church that I'm a part of right now, it's a growing church, started 16 years ago, and it's a growing church, and yet there is a great hunger and desire to continue to grow. I would add that I think that what Gary just said a moment ago was so vital, is that even though we actually have, you found me through a conference we're getting ready to have on church growth and leadership called Momentum, and yet I think it's worth noting that for us, especially, and I'm personally driven by this, is that ultimately this is all about making disciples. And, if we look at, I believe it was Philip that was part of the Red Hot Revival in Samaria, and yet was transported to the desert to reach one. He was successful. Jeremiah was at 40 years that he spent preaching and no converts, and yet he was successful. So I think our definition of success is definitely impacting us on both sides. I think maybe sometimes with the mega churches, we're driven by a definition of success that is numbers of attendees. I think that might happen at some places. I think that in a smaller church that we get to feeling as though that we're not being successful. All these are driven by a scoreboard. Our scoreboard really is an outdated model. It's not really a biblical model, to be honest.
Yeah, one thinks about Paul, I think it's in 1 Corinthians, where he's giving a list of everyone he's baptized, and he says, I didn't come to you to baptize, and then he says, except I baptized that one person, and then it was, I might have baptized this people too, and I've heard one pastor joke before that says, see, even Paul didn't care about church numbers, he wasn't fixated on like how many people he had baptized or how many people he had joined the church. It was about proclaiming the message and so forth. So, but yeah, I think that we do end up focusing on numbers, and one of the things that I think Karl, I want you to come in on this, but one of the things I feel as a pastor of a small church is like, everybody's after me. The world is after me because it has its definition of success, and the church is after me too because it has its definition of success. And even in a Lutheran denomination, who do we lift up as the pastors to speak? At conferences, it's either the one who has achieved the most growth, has the biggest church, or has a PhD, and I'm sure that there are really good small church pastors out there who have insights as well, and maybe even have more time to do study or to offer things to the church, but they're just not brought in. So, Karl, come back on all that.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting place where the two things are hitting here with what Eugene said about a false view of success, but what Gary talked about the unintended consequences of the church growth movement. And I appreciate what both of them say. I'd love to drill down, Gary, on what you said, this idea that the church growth movement began with the idea of making disciples, and that it was, your word was, I wouldn't have used the word, I'm glad you did rather than me, hijacked by the megachurch model. And I think it's because what Eugene brought up, which is we have this bigger is better, and two of you guys are from Texas, so you guys know it better than even the other two
we know
of us
all about
do.
it. Yep.
This idea of bigger being better. And Gary, would you, because you've done way more research on this and have a there's a credibility gap between you and me, and you're way high on the credibility level with this because of your research and because of the reputation you have in this. Tell us a little more about that idea that the church growth movement was really founded not on the idea of building bigger churches, but of finding the best ways to make more disciples. Is that an accurate way of framing it?
Yes, it is. I think if most people would go back and read the books that Donald McGavran wrote, they would feel much better about the church growth movement. He, in his kind of magnum opus, which was called Understanding Church Growth, he actually says in there that attendance is a factor that needs to be looked at. He never says it's the factor. In fact, I just got done writing a year ago. I published a biography on McGavran, and he was more concerned about conversion growth than he was about any other kind of growth. In fact, I found a couple letters that he wrote to some of the megachurch pastors, and he asked them how much of their growth was transfer growth and how much of it was brand new believers who had come to faith in Christ. And he gave a lot more credence to what we would call conversion growth than he did to transfer growth. An interesting thing, too, and he actually wrote his first book on church growth in 1955, and he resisted teaching church growth in the United States and Canada. And the reason is because he understood culture, and he knew the culture of the United States of North America. And he knew what we've all kind of intimated this, the idea that bigger is better. And, in the United States, part of our culture is when you go back to the founding of the country and people on the East Coast, it was a big country. They looked from the East Coast to the West Coast, and there was such a big country to conquer, and big thinking, big ideas, the railroads, the airplane, big factories, big companies. It's been part of the American culture to think big, from the beginning, from the 1600s on. And it's part of our culture. I don't think we can get rid of it. But you look at the Walmarts and things like that, and McGavran understood that, and he didn't really want to teach church growth principles in the United States. For one, he thought America was already pretty well reached by churches and the gospel, and he really wanted to focus on countries around the world where the gospel was not being preached as much. But secondarily, he understood the culture, and he knew that once church growth principles got taught in the United States, that American culture would change the church growth ideas, and that's exactly what's happened.
It seems to me. Sorry, if I didn't mean to interrupt you there.
No,
Gary,
go ahead.
But quite often in almost any field of study, you've got those who do the original research and write the source material, and then you've got those who come alongside and who popularize a concept. And that often in the popularization of a concept, the original source material gets either watered down, twisted, changed, again, to use your word, maybe hijacked into something closer resembling the popular opinion. It sounds like that may have been what happened with the church growth movement, that if you go back to the source material, of course it's happened in the church. When you take a look at Jesus as the source material and us as the popularizers of it, right? We've done the same thing to that, but it sounds like that's what's happened to a lot of the primary source material, that it was much less about the big, but that it was those who popularized it who made it about size. Is that, again, an accurate way of framing that, do you think?
Yeah, it is. the early church growth writers and the early literature was more about church extension, church expansion, if you want to use that term. It was more about planting the church in all of the clans and the tribes and the cities and the neighborhoods of the world. And that's going to happen primarily through small churches.
Yeah, which remains today the primary way in places in the world where church is growing as a percentage of the population. That's still how it's occurring today, right? Through the multiplication of smaller more than through the building of larger.
Well, I think what I liked about your book, Karl, was that you were very careful to be gracious to the mega churches as well as the medium-sized churches and the smaller churches. And I agree with you. It's not about one size or the other. It's about making disciples. And if small churches are making disciples, great. If big churches are making disciples, great.
Absolutely.
My concern a lot of times as a consultant with small churches is that some of them are just happy to, just kind of sit and sour. And
there's way too much of that still.
I know that's not your attitude, but a lot of the small churches, they're not even trying to win anybody to Christ. They're not trying to missionally engage the community. Again, it's about making disciples. It's not about how big you are. And in fact, what I like to say is that every church should not be a mega church, but every church should be a growing church in the sense that every church should be making disciples.
Eugene, I want you to come in on that, but I just wanted to say quickly before we came on the air, Eugene and I were talking, and he mentioned that something like, what was the percent of growth in megachurches was from transfer?
That's what I was actually getting ready to say.
Yeah, go ahead.
The flip side of all that, and I agree with what Gary just said and what Karl's saying. I agree completely. And yet at the same time, the megachurch, from what I read, it appears as though that 80% of the growth is coming from transfer growth. So, even there is not perhaps the emphasis that should be placed on making the disciples as much as it is placed upon an attraction model. And whereas Go to Make Disciples is a deploying model. So I think listening to you guys talk and just thinking about all this, I think we have a lot of work to do on all sides.
Yeah, and the megachurch model is maybe I'm probably the most critical of that approach here, and I'll gladly wear that hat. But it's a very expensive model, right? I mean, you've got to have frontline, A-class sound equipment. You've got to have the music equipment, and you want to create a certain look, and I mean there are churches that spend $5,000 or $10,000 on stage pieces for a sermon series, and have theatrical lighting and this sort of thing. I mean, it creates a look that someone, if they try to imitate that on a smaller scale, is going to look really bad. Whereas you can have, as one of my church members who grew up in the Church of Christ, not the United Church of Christ, but the Church of Christ, he grew up in West Texas, and they had, what do they call it, a shade tree, I don't know, they're basically
Brush
under
Harbor.
leaves. Yeah. Brush Harbor, thank you, there you go. So, and they had next to nothing, but they were faithfully worshiping God. I'm not defending all the Church of Christ theology for the critics out there, but, so, somewhere, but the point is that if the mega church, it seems to be corresponding with big box America generally. I mean, it's kind of the whole McDonaldization of America, Walmartization of America. We don't go to the mom and pop, hardware store anymore. We want to go to Home Depot or Lowe's, and the same is true for. It's almost like church is kind of that same American mentality. We want a product that might not be as good, but it's kind of the same, and it's comfortable. And that seems to me what sometimes is happening in the megachurch. And just to throw out one more thing, and then I promise I'll be quiet because y'all are the experts. But the Reveal study that Willow Creek Association did, I think in 2007, by their own study of over 30,000 people, they found that most people on a scale of 1 to 5, and 1 being a new Christian, 5 being a super duper Army Marine disciple, most people in their churches were at about a 2. So, even megachurches crowd their, what they do in the language of disciple making but they admittedly do a poor job of doing it. So, maybe part of the question is, how do we make disciples? And what, it can't just be about getting the most people in the building. What are the steps we take to actually bring people into that living relationship with God?
Yeah, you mentioned the Willow Creek study, one of the things that one of many things that I'm profoundly grateful to the church growth movement for is one, an emphasis on mission, and two, an emphasis on measuring things, on not just flying by the seat of our pants, but asking ourselves these kinds of hard questions. And I give Willow Creek and Bill Hybels high marks for publishing stats that, quite frankly, had to have felt embarrassing when they came out, because they weren't doing as well as they expected. Most places would have hidden that and said, look over here instead. But we have to, every one of us, whether the church is big, small, whatever, we have to start with accurate data. I think it's the old John Maxwell saying about, leadership starts by defining reality. And whether our church is small, church is big, whatever we think of the church growth movement or anything, we've got to start by defining reality. How good a job are we doing, and how can we do it better? And instead of just predetermining that big is good or big is bad, or same thing for small, but let's find out what's best about each size. Let's define reality, and let's move forward from that baseline, at least, of accurate statistics. And that's one thing that the church growth movement has brought in that I'm profoundly grateful for.
Come in on that, Gary. I know you wanted to come in on that as well.
The bottom line is that whatever we measure, we tend to improve. And so I would agree with what Karl's saying there. When we measure something, we see reality. Many pastors, you ask them, how's your church going? And they say, oh, it's going great. But do they really know? Do they know how many people are coming to faith in Christ? Do they know how many people are involved in small groups? Do they know how many people are regularly praying? Things like that. And but when you measure it, then you know the reality. And then it alerts you that you're not doing so well, or maybe it alerts you that you are doing well in certain areas. But at least then you can begin to target what you want to improve. And I think that's what's happening at Willow Creek. They had the courage to do the survey. They looked at the results, and they're taking steps to correct it. So I think that's a positive thing.
Yeah. Let me throw a question to you on this, Gary. And if it comes across like a gotcha, it's not intended to. I truly don't know the answer, and I'm truly looking for an answer. But it seems to me that in a church of Willow Creek size, if you're dealing with 10, 20, 30,000, whatever they've got, statistics can tell you a great deal, because you've got enough people to get an accurate baseline. And so a 10% change up or down will tell you certain things about what's going on. But the smaller the number of your sample, the less accurate and the less helpful the measurements are. So one of the challenges that I've noticed and that I've faced in dealing with in helping out a lot of small church pastors over the last few years is, if you're in a church of 50 to 75 people, which is the average size of church around the world and in America, a 10%, even a 50% change week to week, up or down, isn't going to tell you nearly as much as a 10% shift in a place the size of Willow Creek. How many people I have in small groups? Well, if my church is 50, my church is a small group.
That's right.
So can you speak to how do small churches measure things in a way, given that their sample size is so small? And again, I'm not trying to play a game here. I'm trying to find these numbers because I'm constantly asked we do move forward, the things that we measure, but measuring is harder in a small church. So I'm trying to figure these things out, and any help I can get, I'll take.
Well, I think what's happening now is that, church growth, people like myself and others, we listen, and we're aware of some of the criticisms, the counseling, and that sort of thing. And so I think what's happened here is that there are adjustments being made in the way we measure. I still think that we do need to measure worship attendance. I honestly think that it's like when you go to a doctor for a yearly checkup, and the doctor takes your pulse. Well, the pulse doesn't change that much, but a pulse becomes kind of a guideline of, is your heart beating too fast? They take your blood pressure. Is your blood pressure, there's certain guidelines of what blood pressure should be. And so if it's too high, too low, that just alerts you to things. And so I think that's what worship attendance is. It doesn't give us all the answers, but it gives us kind of a line that's a consistent measurement that we can look at. So I still think we need to keep worship attendance, but not as a point of bragging or anything like that, just as a point of seeing how we're doing.
Let me, I'm sorry.
But quickly, what is happening now is when I work with churches, I suggest to them that we look at about 4 or 5 factors. That we look at worship attendance, that we also measure the number of people who are involved in ministry. How many people actually are using their gifts? How many people are involved in serving either inside or outside the church? Because I think that's an important measurement of spiritual growth. If we're growing spiritually, we typically are using our gifts in some manner or some way. So, and I think you can measure that in the small church as well as the large church. Willow Creek can measure how many people they have in service and using their gifts. I think small churches can do that also. I think we measure how many people are in Sunday school or how many people are in small groups. Granted, a church of 50 is probably not going to have a small group ministry, so maybe measuring small group attendance is not as vital. In a larger church, I think measuring small group attendance becomes a crucial thing to look at in terms of understanding the overall, health of it. Another thing I think we need to measure, and this can be measured in the small and large church, and that is conversion growth. How many people have come to faith in Christ in our church, through our church? How many adult baptisms? And I would stress adult baptisms. How many adult baptisms have happened in our church? I think that's an indication. What I recommend is that a church pick 4 or 5 key indicators, and that they measure those year after year after year after year. And then you just see over the years if there's any changes, any improvement, that sort of thing.
Eugene, come in on that. And then I just was informed we do have to be done at 6 o'clock Central. There's a show after us that actually anytime there's an execution in Texas, there's a prison show that marks it down. It's a bit of a solemn occasion. But when it happens, and they got to be here. So what I'd like to do is, Eugene, make a point, and then I've got some issues I want to go around and get kind of quick, short answers from each of you guys on. But go ahead, Eugene.
Okay. I would like to answer, give some feedback what you were asking, Karl. That's a question I've been asking myself a lot. Here recently, have been looking at a lot of what they call lag measures and lead measures. And I went over the weight that I said I would not go over for years now. I've been about 3 to 4 pounds over, and for about 5 months now, until this week, because last week I just finally made up my mind that I was going to do something a little different. What I've been doing every day is just measuring my weight. That's what most people do. They get on a scale, and all that does is reveal what I've done the day before or the previous week. I think we do the same thing with our attendance numbers. It's just revealing whatever we have done before to a certain extent, whereas a lead measure actually leads us towards something. So if I start counting my calories, start watching how much I exercise, those kind of things, there's a result that comes out of that. And I think that a new scoreboard that would bring into the factors that would help us grow in towards making disciples. What the end result of that is that you're going to have people who become better disciple makers, and the result of that is that there is a growth in the church, and it may not even be a local church. It may be beyond that. I have a friend who pastored in Louisiana of a town of 200 people. Church had 300, which is kind of crazy. God placed him there for 17 years. And he said when he went there that the Lord spoke to him and said, you're going to train up people who are going to leave from here. And they sent out preachers, missionaries all over the world in a little town of 200 people with a church of 300. And so that would feed exactly what I'm trying to say, is that maybe we should look a little bit more at lead measures as opposed to lag measures.
Well, let me
and
go ahead, Karl.
From what I've discovered, in the smaller churches, you don't have the ability to measure some things that you can in the big churches, the small group being one of them. But that sending capacity, I think, Eugene, is a really huge part of it. Small churches, if we're really leaning into our mission, are going to trim off a lot of things. A small church is not just a big church done on a smaller scale. In a smaller church, you're going to pick one or two different areas of ministry and do it really well, and then say, and these other things that every other church in the neighborhood does, we just don't do. So for instance, there will be some small churches, and ours is one of them. We tend to grow in our sending capacity. It is not unusual for us to send off people, and they come up on Sunday morning, hey, so-and-so's leaving because they're heading off to the mission field, or they're going to have to be pastoring this church, or they've accepted a ministry position over here. And so for us, that's one of the things we measure is our sending, which then impacts, of course, negatively our attendance. But that's part of what we measure, because that's one of the things that we lean into as one of the primary giftings that God has called us to do. Beautiful. So I guess what I'm asking is, I don't know, Mary, maybe Gary, you can help answer this for me. Has anybody done some work on, if you're above a certain number, if you're a megachurch, for instance, here are the top 5 things to measure in this order. And if you're a church under 100, maybe those 5 things are in reverse order, or there's a different thing that's most important. For instance, small group attendance might be one of the main things a big church measures, but it'd be one of the least important things in a small church. Has anybody done research on what order of numbers tends to matter more in the smaller churches?
I don't think so. I haven't seen anything published anyway.
That'll be Gary's next book, I think. Book
there you go.
Book number 25.
Carl.
Let me.
Carl's.
Yeah, we've only got about 10.
I'm not the researcher. I'll leave that to somebody else.
We've only got about 10 minutes, and I'm going to maximize the folks here. What I'd like to do is go around on a handful of topics and get kind of a short answer from each of you. So one thing is healthy small churches, right? Because like Gary said, I think we all would agree that small churches that complain about being small, but when you visit them, they don't welcome new people, they don't have good hospitality. A friend of mine, Buddy Griffin, wrote a book. He visited over 100 churches in Houston, wrote a comprehensive book about what he experienced. It was really fascinating. Over 50% of churches did not even greet him from the parking lot until the time he left, did not even say hello, over 50%. What I'd like to hear from each of you is one thing that a small church should be doing to, maybe not to grow per se, but to be a healthy small church and a high-functioning small church. What is one thing that each of you would say that a small church should do? We'll do Karl, Gary, and then Eugene.
Okay. I think what you said is great. When people choose to go to a small church rather than a big church, the primary reason that's stated, or the two primary reasons: one, it's a place where the pastor knows my name and I can actually contact the pastor personally. So a pastor needs to be accessible to the people, the smaller the church. And secondly, it's where I know and am known. So the friendliness matters more in a small church. It's bad to go to a big church and not feel like you were greeted well and people weren't friendly, but it's brutal to go to a small church and it's not friendly, because in a smaller room, that's just much more awkward. So the friendliness quotient and the availability of the pastor are huge.
Okay, Gary.
Well, I would agree with that. I think the two areas that most small churches can get the most immediate return on, so to speak, is improving the preaching and the worship service as much as possible. And the pastor has a lot of control over the preaching part of that. The pastor can improve the teaching, preaching, and then I think improving the welcome. And if you do those two things, I think that's where you get the most return for your investment the fastest.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I would add, you guys have covered some really great points there. I'll just throw in an extra one. Visiting some churches that in their neighborhood of about 100 people maybe, is that they try to be like a big church, and they have so many events that they wear out the key leadership of the church, and they're not really able to focus on anything in particular. Interesting.
Small groups. It's come up a little bit. A lot of churches, small and medium size, are absolutely convinced they've got to do small groups. I'm interested, what do you think is the threshold where a church really should be doing small group ministry? And Gary, you said it was really critical that it get done. But again, same order. Karl, Gary, and Eugene, quick thoughts on small groups and maybe a threshold of when they're absolutely critical to ministry.
Yeah, my thought on small groups is when people come on a Sunday morning to a mega church, they get great preaching and they get great worship, and what they don't have a big opportunity for is fellowship. So the small group really matters in a big church because that's the thing you're not getting on Sunday morning. But in a small group, when you come on a Sunday morning, if it's a healthy small church, you can get good teaching, you're going to get worship, and you're going to get fellowship. So the idea of a small group to get another dose of fellowship may not be as important in a smaller church. So once a church gets large enough where maybe the fellowship on Sunday morning it diminishes simply because of the size of the crowd, that's when a small group matters a little bit more.
All right, Gary?
Yes, I would say if you want an actual number, that definitely 200. You start getting more than 200 people in worship.
Okay.
It depends a bit if you have Sunday school. Sunday school, a lot of churches don't have adult Sunday school anymore. But some churches still do. If you have Sunday school, which is more of a medium-sized group, a lot of times you can get by without going to small groups. But normally when you get over 200 people, you must have the beginnings, at least, of a small group ministry.
Okay. Eugene?
Yeah, I would just, I agree with that. I would just say that the bigger you grow, the more smaller you should go. You've got to be able to connect with people.
Yeah. What about, okay, I am in a church where we had a fire a few years ago, and we actually used our insurance money to build a new pipe organ. We built a new pipe organ. So we sing hymns. We have Renaissance and Baroque music. We're old fuddy-duddies. We still sing out of a hymnal. We have liturgical worship. I'm curious if y'all have thoughts on whether or not traditional liturgical worship is something that really should be moved away from, and if contemporary, so quote-unquote, I don't really like that word because it's fraught with peril, but if contemporary worship with guitar, drums, etc., if that really should be embraced, if you will. So again, Karl, Gary, and Eugene.
I think anything can work as long as it's done well, and as long as there's enough of a population base around who are looking for it.
Okay.
The millennial generation especially is open to all kinds of different things, and in a town like Houston, there's enough people that want that can be done and reach people if it's done well.
Okay. Gary?
I would agree. The place where I see the more traditional liturgical churches thriving is usually near university campuses where you have a kind of a millennial group of people who want to worship with kind of candles, stained glass, darkness. They want to kind of go back to some of the old ways. If you get into the suburbs, I find very little or very few, if any, churches that are growing using the traditional liturgy, whether it's Presbyterian or Episcopalian or whatever, style. And I think what Karl said is exactly right. You've got to have a critical mass of people who desire that. people are listening to CDs of organ music in their cars. I honestly don't think very many are, and therefore I think that gives us a clue as to, that you're not going to grow churches primarily using that style of music.
See, my dad listens to pipe organ music in his car, so I never had a chance. I was always going to have an organ in my church. But okay, Eugene, last word on that topic.
I think that was greatly covered right there. So
okay. The only other point I was going to make, and I do have to go because we've got another show coming up behind me here. Unfortunately, I was hoping to go long today with the three of us. Maybe we could do this again in a few months with maybe a list of topics spelled out or something like that.
Let's do it again.
Great, okay. But my only other question, maybe we can leave it for next time, was something like how important is pastoral knowledge of each member? Because obviously the bigger you get, the more removed your average parishioner, not members of a leadership team, not members of the worship team, etc., they're going to be more removed from the pastor. And then I think some people that argue for smaller churches, they do it on a biblical basis. You see the kind of deacons and elders model really of then, there being kind of knowledge. So I think that's one question too we just didn't have time to get to today, but it's one that I think about a lot. As I sometimes can grow weary in having personal relationships with each and every member. As you know, it goes in cycles. But anyway, quickly, everyone give your website, okay? Karl, where can people find you?
newsmallchurch.com.
All right, newsmallchurch.com. And Gary?
churchgrowthnetwork.com.
All right, and Eugene?
equippingleaders.net.
equippingleaders.net. I should have given that out before. Folks, thanks so much for listening today. The prison show's got a special show coming in right after me for you KPFT folks. And to my guests, thank you all so very, very much. I'll be corresponding with you all via email. And so we'll be in touch. I'll get the show out here in the next day on the podcast. If you're listening on KPFT and you want to listen to this and other shows like it, Sin Boldly Podcast on iTunes is where to go. Thanks again to my guest.
Thank you.
And until next time.
Thank you.
All right, and until next time, may you have the peace that passes all understanding. See ya.